Welcome back to the discussion as we dive into our top 10 misconceptions about what it means to plant a church. If you did not see 1 through 5 yet, go ahead and look in the link of this video, or you can click this card right here and it'll take you to the first 5 misconceptions. I would really suggest watching that video before you watch this one. But if you have, let's go ahead and let's get started. So, misconception number 6 is that in order to plant a church, you need a building. This one is really off base in the sense that, first off, the church is not a building. So have you ever said, and I've been guilty of this too, but like, hey, I'll meet you at the church at 9 o'clock or whatever. Really what you're saying there is like, hey, I'm going to meet you at this group of people who passionately love Jesus and each other at 9 o'clock. It doesn't make sense. The church is not a building. The church is the group of people that meet there, is the group of people that live within that city that believe in Jesus, but it is not a building. And so really, I think a building can be a really big hindrance to starting or planting a church, because once you have a building, then all of a sudden you have a mortgage to pay. Once you have a building, you have repairs to make, you've got utilities to pay, insurance, on and on and on. So what it does is it's actually kind of a bit of a distraction from what the church is supposed to be. Now, does that mean that churches shouldn't have buildings? No, I'm completely fine with a church having a building. But when starting out, when planting, when time and money and resources and everything are really, really vital, I don't think that it's probably the best thing to do to think about what building you're going to meet at. You see, buildings are kind of a distraction from what I think God called the church to be. I really think if you look around, any city, you see these big, extravagant church buildings, but what is the health and vitality of the people meeting inside? And so just continuing to remember that, hey, it's not about the building. You could meet on the street, in a coffee shop, in a house, wherever you want to. The church is the group of people meeting together, not the location that they're meeting. The 7th misconception about planning a church is this thought that your church has to look like every other church. So let's focus first just on our weekly gatherings. I've always found it really interesting why pretty much every church that I can remember attending kind of has the same schedule that they go through. You show up, everyone goes through, 3 or 4 songs of worship. Then you sit down, and normally there's an announcement time. Maybe you'll do a little 1 or 2 minute handshakes and greetings with other people. Then you'll, do the tithe, where you give your tithe and they pass the baskets. Then the pastor comes up and gives the sermon. And then sometimes there's another song or two at the end, or sometimes, it's just time to go. So when we think about planting a church, that's immediately what someone thinks, like, oh, you're going to have a weekly gathering where that's what happens. Not necessarily. Is anything that I just said there wrong with what the church normally does? No, there's nothing wrong with it. All those things are good, they're biblical. But what I am saying is that you don't have to do it exactly like that. The 8th misconception about planting a church is the thought that you have to have almost like a business plan in place before you start. Like you have to have this full master strategy on how you're going to take the church from this small group of people to grow it to this big, massive organization. And I got to think back to the book of Acts and when the New Testament had the first revival. There's 3,000 people coming to the Lord in one day. I don't think that the apostles or the leadership there had a clue really what they were going to do when it comes to strategy on really implementing processes and things with those people. Remember, the church is not this institution. A church is actually a group of people. And so having all of those plans and pieces in place prior to starting a church, I don't think is necessary and may actually be a hindrance because, we like to go in a certain direction. I've been guilty of this a million times, and, oh, I think this is God, I think this is God, and then all of a sudden halfway through, he diverts us in a big way, I want to be open to that. I want to be open to the Lord moving and shifting. And so I think it's actually, especially when you're starting something like this, it's a benefit to have sort of a loose structure, to not have every plan in place. The 9th misconception about starting a church is that you have to have a bunch of different programs or ministries set up when you plant the church or shortly thereafter. You know, the thought comes like, oh man, if we're planting a church, that means that we're going to need a worship team. That means that we're then going to need a greeting team. We're going to need someone to take care of the children. We should probably have a young adults ministry. We need to have a youth ministry. We should probably have this feeding program. Whoa, like there's just so much stress that just comes to me when I even think about all of that. Now, everything that I just mentioned, it's not against the Bible. It's actually, there's some really, really good things in there. I've benefited a lot from specific ministries like that. But we want to be careful to not have our emphasis be on all the programs that we want to implement when we're starting a church. Once again, I'm going to say this a million times. The emphasis has to be what the Bible commands us to do as a group of people when we meet together. That needs to be just foundational. And then over time, if the Lord directs and we have the opportunity to add on other programs that are a little bit more specific to people, great. I'm for that. But one thing that I think that we've fallen into the trap of here in the Westernized Christian Church is that we feel this pressure that we have to have all of those things in place. And if you don't have the resources, the time, the money, the energy, the people to be able to efficiently manage and do all of those programs, the programs actually kind of backfire a little bit. They end up sucking a lot of life from the church rather than giving life to the church. And so I think if we start out with a firm foundation of what God's called the church to be, this passionate group of people loving each other and loving God, and then we start to think about the other things that He may be leading us on, that is going to be a better process rather than jumping in thinking that we have to start 10 different ministries at once in order to appease everybody. Our 10th and final misconception about starting a church is that you need to have a lot of money in order to plant a church. That is not true at all, actually. Now, if you're going to plant more through the traditional model of church, then yeah, you're going to need some money to do it because you're going to need to pay a pastor, probably pay a secretary, maybe pay a worship pastor, and the list goes on. Building, utilities, all those things. You're going to need quite a bit of money in order to run an organization like that. But if when you're planting a church, your focus is on gathering people who love God and love one another and really want to see the gospel spread in their community, then it actually costs pretty much nothing in order to do that. You can meet at other places. You can have people who still take on these leadership responsibilities, but if you keep the group small enough, you don't have to pay them. I think a lot of times pastors need to get paid because they're overseeing 100 or 200 people. And how effectively one person can do that, I don't know. I couldn't do it myself. There's ways when we're planting churches that don't require all this upfront seed money in order to actually get started. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this, that you found these 10 points that I've discussed really insightful. If you have any questions, please go ahead, leave them in the comments. I would love to answer them. I'm sure there's some things that might have stirred some people up in this. As I've said before, my concern is not to get people all riled up. I don't want to be disruptive, but what I do want to be is someone who is looking at the scriptures and seeing what God is asking us as the church to do, and then teaching that and proclaiming that. And so that is really just my heart here. I want to see what the Bible says and I want to go after it. And so if you have any thought about planting a church yourself, you may feel God stirring that in your heart, that is what I would suggest you do. Please don't just look around to every institution. Don't pick up the next church growth, hack book. Think about what Jesus wants. Really study the scriptures. See what the church is meant to be. Talk to other people who want that authentic expression of community, and then do it in the context of that community. Don't just do it alone. Do it with other people where the Bible is at the center of the entire plant.